History of commerce. In the year 79 AD, when Vesuvius buried Pompeii under tons of burning ash and killed thousands of people in a matter of hours, the archaeologists who excavated the city 17 centuries later found something among the corpses and charred buildings that no one expected. Perfectly sealed olive oil amphorae lined up in the shops, in the kitchens, in the port warehouses. The oil was still inside. The city had died, but the oil had survived. That was no coincidence. That was a sign of what olive oil meant to the ancient world, of how deeply embedded it was in every aspect of Mediterranean civilization, of why the Romans considered it valuable enough to store, protect, and transport to the edges of the known empire. And what you are going to discover in the next few minutes is that olive oil is not simply a cooking ingredient. It is the substance that built civilizations, that funded wars, that anointed kings and gods, that enslaved entire peoples, that saved lives, and that destroyed economies. It is the oldest liquid in the world, with its own name, and its history begins long before Pompeii. It begins before Rome. It begins before Greece. It begins in a place that most people would never mention if you asked them where olive oil was born. Approximately 8,000 years ago on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, in the region today occupied by Syria, Lebanon, northern Israel, and southern Turkey, humans discovered that certain wild olive trees produced a fruit whose interior, when crushed between two stones, released a thick, bright liquid of a color between green and gold that was unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't water. It wasn't animal blood. It was something that came out of the earth. From a tree, from a small and bitter fruit. The first humans who pressed an olive between their palms and saw that liquid flow were not doing it to cook. They were doing it by accident, out of curiosity, out of hunger, and what they discovered changed the course of human history in ways that even today, 8 millennia later, are still visible in every bottle of oil in any kitchen on the planet. The wild olive tree, the one that existed before anyone cultivated it, was a small, twisted tree with tiny olives and almost no pulp. It did not produce enough to be useful on a large scale. But someone, at some point, between the year 6000 and 4000 BC, had the patience and intelligence to select the trees that produced the most fruit, to prune the branches, to learn that the olive tree takes years to yield its first real harvest, but that once it does, it can live for centuries without ever stopping production. The first communities to domesticate the olive tree on the Levantine coast were not simply learning to grow a tree yet. They were investing in the future in a way that no other plant allowed. A wheat field produces in months. An olive tree takes between 4 and 10 years to start bearing fruit, and between 20 and 40 years to reach full production. Planting an olive tree is not an act of agriculture. It is an act of generational faith. The man who plants the olive tree knows that he will not see its peak. He is planting it for his son or his son's son. That characteristic changed something fundamental in the way ancient civilizations thought about territory, about property, and about permanence. A nomadic tribe does not plant olive trees because they will not be there when the tree matures. But a community that plants olive trees is declaring that they are going to stay, that this soil is theirs, that this place is their home forever. The olive tree was, in a sense, the first contract human beings signed with the earth. And the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean were the first to sign that contract. The Phoenicians were the ones who turned that local contract into a global business between the year 1000 and 500 BC. These seafaring merchants, setting sail from the coasts of modern-day Lebanon, became the distributors of olive oil throughout the Mediterranean. They carried amphorae of oil from the Levant to Carthage, to Sicily, to the coasts of Spain, to the Greek islands. But they didn't just sell oil, they carried olive cuttings, young seedlings, and taught local populations how to grow them. The Phoenicians were not simply trading, they were expanding the geography of the olive tree, transforming entire Mediterranean basins into a gigantic oil orchard. That expansion took centuries, and when the Greeks entered the scene, they found a Mediterranean world that already knew about oil, but had not yet made it sacred. They did that to the Greeks. Olive oil was not a product, it was a miracle. And like every miracle, it needed an origin story to explain it. The one they chose involves two gods and a city. According to the most widespread Greek tradition, Athena and Poseidon competed for the right to be the patrons of the most important city in Attica. Zeus set the rules. Each would offer a gift to the citizens, and the best gift would decide the winner. Poseidon struck the rock of the Acropolis with his trident, and salt water gushed from the crack, a sea spring in the heart of the earth. It was a marvel. It was power. It was the dominance of the god of the seas materialized in stone. Athena did something different. She planted an olive tree, a small, twisted tree with pale silver leaves that trembled in the wind. The citizens of Attica deliberated and chose the olive tree, not because it was more impressive than a spring, but because it was more useful. The oil it produced fed, healed, illuminated, and anointed. Poseidon's salt water was undrinkable. Athena's oil was good for everything. And so, according to the Greeks, Athens was born, a city founded on the superiority of olive oil over everything else. That story was not just mythology. It was economic policy expressed in divine language. The Athenians protected their olive trees with extraordinarily strict laws. Cutting down an olive tree in Attica was a crime punishable by exile. It didn't matter if the tree was on your own land. It didn't matter if it was dead, diseased, or in the middle of a road. The olive tree was property of the state, protected by the goddess, and no one had the right to destroy it. There was even a specific court in Athens, dedicated exclusively to judging cases of illegal olive tree felling. The oil those trees produced had uses that went far beyond the kitchen. It was used in the lamps that lit homes, temples, and city streets. When night fell, it was used in gymnasiums, where athletes covered their bodies with oil before training and competing. Not out of vanity, but because the oil protected their skin from dust, sun, and the friction of combat. It was used in funerary rituals to anoint the bodies of the dead before cremation. It was used as a prize. The winners of the Panathenaic Games, the most important athletic festival in Athens, did not receive gold or land. They received amphorae of oil, called Panathenaic amphorae, and they were decorated with images of Athena and the event in which the athlete had triumphed. A victor could receive up to 140 amphorae of oil in a single competition, an amount equivalent to the work of an average artisan. Oil was the ultimate prize because oil was the supreme symbol of wealth, civilization, and divine favor. The Greeks took the olive tree with them when they founded colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Marseille, on the southern coast of what is now France, was founded by Greek colonists from Phocaea around the year 600 BC. They brought olive trees and planted them in the limestone hills surrounding the new city. Those olive trees still exist. In the French Provence, there are specimens dating back to the Greek era. Trees that have survived wars, conquests, epidemics, and revolutions for more than 500 years, and that still produce olives every autumn. The longevity of the olive tree is not just a botanical curiosity. It is one of the reasons why oil could become the economic foundation of entire civilizations. A well-cared-for olive tree can live ling ling ling, ling ling ling, A for 3. years. There are olive trees in the eastern Mediterranean whose age is estimated at more than 500 years and which, according to local records, already existed when Alexander the Great crossed those lands to conquer Persia. They are living organisms that have witnessed the birth, rise, and fall of entire empires without ever ceasing to bear fruit. But it was Rome that turned olive oil into the economic engine of the ancient world. When the Roman Republic began its expansion across the Mediterranean in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, it brought with it not only legions but also amphorae. Olive oil was part of the Roman army's basic equipment. Soldiers used it for cooking, preserving food, waterproofing the leather of their armor and sandals, cleaning their bodies in the absence of soap, and healing superficial wounds. A Roman army on the march consumed enormous amounts of oil, and to supply that consumption, Rome needed ever larger sources of production. At first, the most important oil-producing regions for Rome were those in southern Italy, Campania and Apulia, where the climate allowed the cultivation of high-quality olive trees. But as the empire expanded, Rome discovered something extraordinary. Almost all the territories it conquered in the Mediterranean were already producing oil, or had the ideal conditions to do so. Greece produced oil. North Africa produced oil. Spain produced oil. The Levant produced oil. Instead of destroying that existing agricultural infrastructure, Rome absorbed it, regulated it, standardized it, and turned it into one of the most important sources of wealth in the known world. The most impressive testament to Roman oil consumption is a place in Rome that few tourists visit today, and that for centuries no one understood what it was. It is called Monte Testaccio. It is in the Testaccio neighborhood, south of the historic center of Rome, and at first glance, it just looks like a small hill covered in vegetation. But it is not a natural hill. It is an artificial mountain built entirely with fragments of olive oil amphorae. It is about 50 meters high, 100 meters in diameter, and is estimated to contain the remains of between 40 and 50 million amphorae. Each of those amphorae brought oil to Rome from the empire's provinces, mainly from Baetica, the region of modern-day Spanish Andalusia, which was the largest producer of oil in the known world during the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. When the amphorae arrived at the port and their contents were unloaded in the warehouses of Rome, the clay containers were deliberately broken because the oil that remained stuck to the clay walls would ferment and make it impossible to reuse them to store fresh oil. So they broke them, sorted them according to their origin, which was marked with seals in the clay, and threw the fragments onto what eventually became Monte Testaccio. That pile of broken pottery is the most eloquent record that exists of Rome's appetite for oil, 40 million amphorae, each with a capacity of between 20 and 70 liters of olive oil alone, at a single unloading point alone, over roughly 300 years. Baetica, that Roman province we know today as Andalusia, was not simply a supplier of oil, it became the oil factory of the ancient world. The banks of the Guadalquivir River, which the Romans called the Varieties, were flanked for miles by olive groves that produced on an almost industrial scale. The families of great Hispano-Roman landowners who controlled those plantations accumulated colossal fortunes. Some of them became the richest men in the Roman Empire. Several emperors, including Trajan and Hadrian, were born or had roots in that oil-producing province in southern Hispania. It is no coincidence. The economic power generated by Andalusian oil translated directly into political power in Rome. The Romans organized the production and distribution of oil with an efficiency that would not be seen again in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. There were standardized contracts for purchasing olives before the harvest. There were state inspectors who verified the quality of the oil before sealing it in the amphorae. There were established maritime routes with specialized ships for transporting oil. There were warehouses in the main ports where the oil was sorted, appraised, and redistributed. And there was a price system regulated by the Roman state to ensure that oil was accessible to the population of Rome, which at its peak exceeded 1 million inhabitants. Olive oil was part of the annona, the system of basic provisions that the Roman state guaranteed to its citizens, along with wheat and wine. Oil was part of the regular distributions that kept the capital's population fed and calm. In a way, the Roman Empire stood on 3 liquid pillars: the water of its aqueducts, the wine of its vineyards, and the oil of its olive groves. The Roman use of oil went far beyond food. Thermal baths. The thermae, which were the heart of Roman social life in all cities of the empire, operated partly thanks to oil. Bathers rubbed their bodies with oil before entering the steam baths. Then they used an instrument called a strigil, a kind of curved metal or bone scraper, to remove the mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt from the skin. It was the most widespread method of body cleaning in the Roman world and worked better than the soap available at the time. The oil recovered with the strigil was not thrown away. It was collected, filtered, and reused. Sometimes it was even sold. There is evidence that some athletes sold the oil and sweat from their bodies to buyers willing to pay for it, believing it had healing or magical properties. In Rome, literally nothing related to oil was wasted. Oil lamps illuminated every corner of the Roman world, from the luxurious patrician mansions on the Palatine to the insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks where common people lived in often precarious conditions. Oil lamps were the only artificial lighting system available, and their shape changed little for centuries. A clay or bronze vessel with oil and a linen or papyrus wick that burned with a small, steady flame. The quality of the oil determined the quality of the light. The first pressed oil, the purest, burned cleaner and produced less smoke. Lower quality oil, extracted from fermented olives or through harsher methods, produced a flickering flame and black smoke that blackened ceilings and damaged lungs. The poor of Rome lived with that smoke. The rich did not. When the Roman Empire began to fragment in the 3rd century and finally collapsed in the West in the 5th century, the oil trade suffered a brutal disruption. The maritime routes that had connected Andalusia with Rome for centuries became unsafe. The great estates that produced oil on an industrial scale were looted, abandoned, or broken up. Production did not disappear, but it became localized, reduced, and retreated to the self-consumption of small communities that no longer had access to the markets of the past. In the chaos of the Gothic, Vandal, and Hun invasions that convulsed the Western Mediterranean between the 5th and 6th centuries, olive oil went from being the lubricant of a global civilization to becoming a local survival product. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Eastern Roman Empire, what we know as the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, oil maintained its centrality. And from there, a new civilizing force that emerged in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula would receive oil as part of its Mediterranean heritage and turn it into something more, into a religious symbol of the highest order. The Quran explicitly mentions the olive tree not as a vague metaphor, but as a blessed tree of light, of an origin neither Eastern nor Western, whose oil illuminates, even if fire does not touch it. To medieval Islam, olive oil was not just food or medicine. It was light. It was purity. It was the substance closest to the divine that existed in nature. The Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates, which dominated the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world between the 7th and 11th centuries, adopted, perfected, and expanded olive oil production throughout their vast territories. Olive growing techniques were refined. Extraction methods improved. Arab physicians like Avicenna wrote extensively about the therapeutic properties of oil, distinguishing between varieties, extraction methods, and medicinal uses, with a precision that would not be surpassed in Europe for centuries. When the Crusaders arrived in the Levant in the year 1096, they found a world in which olive oil was absolutely central to daily life, to the economy, and to religious practice. And what they found deeply disturbed them because they were European knights, coming from lands where olive oil was so scarce and expensive that many of them had never tasted it. In medieval Europe, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, olive oil was an item of absolute luxury, reserved for religious rites and for the tables of the most powerful. The Catholic Church needed oil for its sacraments: baptism, confirmation, extreme unction, the ordination of priests and bishops, all required holy oil. The chrism, which had to be olive oil, bishops and abbots controlled access to oil with extraordinary zeal. Monasteries lucky enough to be in climates where the olive tree could grow, in the south of France, in Italy, in Spain, produced their own oil and kept it under lock and key. The rest of Europe depended on imports that arrived irregularly and at exorbitant prices. A peasant in medieval Germany or northern France cooked with lard or butter, never with olive oil. Oil was for altars, not skillets. That reality began to change with the Crusades. The thousands of knights, mercenaries, pilgrims, and merchants who traveled to the eastern Mediterranean between the 10th and 11th centuries returned to Europe with more than relics and scars. They returned with new tastes, with the knowledge that there was a way of cooking that relied on oil instead of animal fat, with an appetite for spices, culinary techniques, and ingredients their ancestors had never known. The Mediterranean trade that revived during and after the Crusades turned cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa into oil middlemen between the producing Mediterranean and the consuming north of Europe. And as oil reached the north, its price slowly dropped and its use expanded. First, among the nobility, then among the mercantile bourgeoisie, and eventually among broader segments of the population in regions where Italian ports had commercial influence. In the Iberian Peninsula, olive oil had never ceased to be central. During the 8 centuries of Arab presence in most of Spanish territory, the olive grove expanded and was perfected in ways that surpassed anything the Romans had known. Andalusian agronomists wrote detailed treatises on olive cultivation, on when to prune, how to water in drought climates, how to recognize tree diseases, and how to treat them. The Spanish word for oil, aceite, comes directly from the Arabic azite. The word aceituna also comes from Arabic. The word for oil in all languages of the Iberian Peninsula bears the imprint of the Arab civilization that transformed the Spanish olive grove into the most productive in the world. When the northern Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered those territories between the 10th and 15th centuries, they did not destroy the olive groves. They inherited them, and along with the olive trees, they inherited centuries of Arab agronomic knowledge on how to care for them. The expansion of Spain and Portugal to the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries created a new phase in the history of oil. Spanish colonizers took olive trees to the Americas. They planted them in Peru, in Chile, in Mexico, in Argentina. The climate of the South American Pacific coasts proved surprisingly suitable for the olive tree, but the Spanish crown, in one of the most brutally protectionist economic decisions in colonial history, banned the production of oil in the American colonies to protect the business of peninsular producers. Colonists could plant olive trees for domestic use, but they could not commercialize the oil. All oil for general consumption had to be imported from Spain. That restriction was not lifted until the American independence movements of the 19th century put an end to the colonial system. By then, the olive trees that had survived on the colonial estates of Peru and Chile were centuries-old trees, some of which are still producing olives today. In the 15th and 16th centuries, olive oil also played a critical role in the development of the Mediterranean economy that many history books ignore. Soap, the cities of Marseille in France and Castile in Spain, became the production centers for the most valued olive oil soap in the world, Marseille soap, made with pure olive oil, following a process that combined oil with seawater and lye, became the standard of quality for European soap for centuries. The kings of France regulated its production with laws that specified the exact ingredients, proportion, and quality controls. Castile soap, which the English called Castile soap, and which is still sold under that name worldwide today, was a top-tier export product for Golden Age Spain. Olive oil was not just food. It was hygiene. It was luxury. It was part of the language of refinement and civilization in a Europe that was beginning to rediscover bodily wellness after medieval centuries marked by disease and dirt. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century did not find olive oil to be an easily industrialized product. Unlike what happened with sugar or wheat, the olive tree is a tree that resists mechanization. Olive harvesting, even today, is still largely manual in the highest quality plantations, because olives struck mechanically get damaged and produce poorer quality oil than hand-picked ones. For centuries, the basic extraction method was the same, pressing crushed olives between layers of esparto grass, so the oil would flow downward by gravity and pressure. Large stone or wooden presses were the heart of every artisan. The oil production facility throughout the Mediterranean. The first mechanical steam-driven press appeared in the 19th century, but it took decades to be widely adopted because traditional producers distrusted it. And because mechanically produced oil in some cases tasted worse than traditionally pressed oil, what did change in the 19th century was the scientific understanding of oil. French and Italian chemists began analyzing the composition of olive oil with tools that previous producers had not possessed. They discovered that the oil was mainly monounsaturated fatty acids, mostly oleic acid, and that this composition gave it extraordinary stability against oxidation compared to other vegetable oils. They also discovered that the oil's acidity, measured as a percentage of free fatty acids, determined its quality in a way that could be measured and certified. At the end of the 19th century, the chemical parameters that distinguish extra virgin oil from other lower grades were established for the first time. The category that is today the most highly valued on the market, extra virgin with less than 0.8% acidity, was not a distinction that existed in the minds of Roman or medieval producers. It is an invention of modern chemistry applied to an ancient product. The 20th century brought an undeclared war between olive oil and new industrial vegetable oils. In the early 20th century, the German and American chemical industries developed processes to extract oil from oilseeds, sunflower, corn, soy, rapeseed at a scale and cost that olive oil could never match. A field of sunflowers produces oil in months. An olive grove takes decades to reach peak production. A field of sunflowers can be fully mechanized. A quality olive grove requires manual labor. During the 1940s, 1950, and 1960s, as Europe recovered from World War II and rich northern countries adopted increasingly industrialized diets, olive oil lost ground to seed oils in northern European and North American markets. It was more expensive, harder to get, and less suited to Anglo-Saxon cooking, which had run on butter and animal fat for centuries. What saved olive oil globally was not gastronomy, but medical science. In the 1950s and 1960s, American epidemiologist Ansel Keys led one of the most ambitious health studies of the 20th century, comparing cardiovascular disease rates in 7 different countries with different diets. What he found in Mediterranean countries, especially in southern Italy and Greece, was something that contradicted the medical consensus of the time. The populations of Crete and southern Italy consumed high-fat diets, mainly from olive oil, and yet they had the lowest rates of heart disease in the developed world. In the 1950s, a middle-aged Cretan man was many times less likely to die of a heart attack than an American of the same age. That observation triggered decades of research into the so-called Mediterranean diet and placed olive oil at the center of a scientific debate that has not yet completely closed, but which has produced strong enough conclusions to transform the global oil market, starting in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s and 1990s. Olive oil began appearing in kitchens in Northern Europe and North America, where it had never been. Supermarkets in London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo began dedicating entire aisles to oil varieties that 2 decades earlier were completely unknown outside the Mediterranean. Global olive oil consumption grew steadily for 30 years. And with that growth came problems the oil world had never known on that scale. Olive oil fraud is one of the worst-kept secrets in the global food market and one of the least penalized. When the global demand for extra virgin olive oil exceeded the actual production capacity of oil in that category, some producers and distributors found ways to make up the difference. The most common method is mixing refined olive oil, which is low-quality oil subjected to chemical treatments to remove its taste and smell, with small amounts of extra virgin oil, and selling it as pure extra virgin. There are bolder variants, mixing olive oil with cheaper seed oils like sunflower or hazelnut, and selling it as olive oil, and even more sophisticated variants, lampante olive oil, the lowest on the quality scale, decolorized, deodorized, and packaged with labels suggesting premium geographical origins that the product never had. Investigations that have uncovered this fraud over the past 20 years reveal that a significant proportion of the oil sold as extra virgin in the markets of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Northern Europe does not meet the chemical or organoleptic standards that define that category. In California, where the olive oil industry grew exponentially from the 1990s, researchers at the University of California, Davis analyzed samples of oils labeled as extra virgin sold in American supermarkets and found that most imported oils from big Italian and Spanish brands failed to meet the category's criteria. The industry's reaction was predictable: deny, question the methodology, lobby regulators, and carry on. Extra virgin olive oil is one of the most adulterated foods in the world, and also one of the foods that receives the least regulatory scrutiny compared to what is at stake. Adulterated olive oil is not simply a problem of gastronomic quality. It is a public health problem. The cardiovascular health benefits associated with extra virgin olive oil are linked to specific compounds, primarily polyphenols, which are found in premium oil but disappear in refined or adulterated oil. A consumer who buys extra virgin olive oil, believing they are getting its anti-inflammatory and cardiovascular properties, but who is actually buying refined oil mixed with a small percentage of extra virgin, is not getting what they paid for and is paying considerably more than they should for a product that is not what it claims to be. Today, Spain is the largest producer of olive oil on the planet. It produces roughly half of all the world's olive oil, the Andalusian region. The same one the Romans called Baetica remains the epicenter of that production. The municipality of Jaén, in the heart of Andalusia, is probably the place with the highest concentration of olive trees per square kilometer on Earth. The landscape of the province of Jaén is a carpet of olive trees stretching from horizon to horizon in all directions, broken only by the mountain ranges that flank it. From the air, it seems impossible that so much green wealth exists in such arid land. There are approximately 66 million olive trees in a single Spanish province. 66 million trees that in many cases have been growing in that soil since before the Spanish state existed. Since before Castile existed, since the time when that territory was part of Arab Al-Andalus or Roman Hispania. The world's second largest producer is Italy. But Italy's relationship with oil is more complicated than Spain's. Italy produces less oil than it consumes and exports. A significant portion of the oil sold with Italian labels in world markets is not oil produced in Italy, but oil imported from Spain, Greece, or Tunisia that is bottled in Italy and legally allowed to be labeled as a European Union product, or even in some cases misleadingly with references to Italian heritage. The image of Italy as an olive oil paradise is partly real, because Italy has extraordinary olive varieties and production traditions, and partly a marketing construct that has sold Italian origin at premium prices using oil from other countries. Greece, the third major producer, has a relationship with olive oil that is perhaps deeper than that of any other country. The average Greek consumes approximately 20 liters of olive oil a year, the highest per capita amount in the world, more than double that of Italians, and more than 10 times what the average American consumes in Crete, the island where Ansel Keys observed those extraordinarily low rates of heart disease in the 1950s. Consumption can exceed 25 liters per person per year. It is a number that would seem scandalous to any North American nutritionist until they remember that those same Cretans have some of the highest life expectancies on the planet, and that cardiovascular disease on the island, although it has increased with the modernization of the diet, remains notably lower than in Northern Europe or America. Tunisia, Morocco, and Turkey are major producers frequently ignored in the Western narrative of olive oil, but they have olive-growing traditions stretching back thousands of years. North Africa was one of the Roman Empire's largest oil-producing regions. The ruins of Roman cities in Libya and Tunisia, cities like Leptis Magna or Sufetula, are surrounded by the remains of oil presses that once processed astronomical quantities of olives to feed Rome and its army. This productive heritage never completely disappeared, and today Tunisia is one of the world's largest olive oil exporters. Although much of that oil is sold in bulk to Italy and Spain, where it is bottled under other labels, the olive that produces the oil is not a simple fruit. There are hundreds of olive varieties in the world, each with its own characteristics that produce oils of distinct flavor, aroma, color, and chemical composition. The Picule olive, which dominates the olive groves of Jaén and is the most widely cultivated variety on the planet, produces an oil with pronounced bitterness, spiciness, strong herbaceous notes, and exceptional stability that makes it very resistant to oxidation. The Hoja Blanca, widespread in Córdoba and Seville, produces a milder oil with notes of almond and green apple, less stable but highly prized for its balance. The Arbequina, originally from Catalonia but now grown worldwide, including California and Australia, produces a smooth, fruity oil with little bitterness, easy to drink on its own, and very popular in markets where the consumer is not used to the intensity of traditional extra virgin. In Italy, the Frantoio, Moraiolo, and Licino are the main Tuscan varieties. In Greece, the Koroneiki is the undisputed queen, a tiny olive that produces an oil with exceptionally high polyphenol concentrations. Each variety is the result of centuries of selection and adaptation to a specific soil, climate, and culture. To lose an olive variety is to lose an irreplaceable fragment of the Mediterranean's biological and cultural heritage. The olive harvest is one of the oldest rituals still practiced in the Mediterranean world, in exactly the same way as 2,000 years ago. In autumn, when the olives reach the optimal ripeness for oil, which is not when they are completely ripe, but when they are changing from green to purple, harvesters climb the trees or use long poles to comb the branches and drop the fruit onto tarps spread on the ground. Mechanization has reached the olive grove in the form of mechanical shakers that attach to the tree trunk and shake the olives down in seconds, and in the form of self-propelled harvesters for modern super-intensive olive plantations. But in traditional olive groves of centuries-old or millennia-old trees, aggressive mechanization is impossible without damaging the trees. Those trees are still harvested by hand. Just as in the times of the Greeks, the most critical moment in all extra virgin olive oil production is the time that passes between harvest and extraction. Olives are living fruits that continue their biological processes after being picked. If they are piled in large heaps and left to sit for days before being processed, the internal temperature of the pile increases, the olives begin to ferment, and the oil they produce will have higher acidity and a worse taste. Producers seeking the highest quality take the olives to the mill the same day they are harvested, ideally within a few hours. More milling, which uses stainless steel mills instead of traditional granite stones, crushes the olives into a paste that is then kneaded for 25 or 30 minutes at a controlled temperature to encourage the oil droplets to join together, a process called malaxation, and then centrifuged to separate the oil from the vegetation, water, and solids. That entire process, from the olive on the tree to the oil in the steel tank, can be completed in less than 4 hours. And the result, when the fruit is good and the process is careful, is a liquid with a color between deep green and gold that smells of freshly cut grass, green tomato, artichoke, almond, and which, when tasted, produces first a fruity flavor, then a bitterness that is healthy polyphenols, and finally, a peppery kick in the throat that is the unmistakable sign that oleocanthal, one of the most potent anti-inflammatory compounds in the plant world, is present in sufficient quantity. The science of extra virgin olive oil in the 21st century has revealed that this golden liquid contains a natural pharmacy of bioactive compounds that no other vegetable oil replicates. Oleocanthal has anti-inflammatory properties that in laboratory trials have been shown to be functionally similar to ibuprofen. Although no one is saying that olive oil is a medicine, hydroxytyrosols and tyrosols are high-potency antioxidants that protect cells from oxidative damage. Squalene, present in significant amounts in olive oil, has protective properties for the skin and possibly cellular membranes. Oleic acid itself, the main component of the oil, is metabolized in ways that favor the cardiovascular lipid profile. The combination of all these compounds in a natural matrix is what makes extra virgin olive oil different from any nutritional supplement attempting to replicate its effects. It is not just about the ingredients. It is about how they interact with each other, within the oil, and with human metabolism, in ways that science has not yet fully understood. The oldest olive trees in the world continue to produce olives. In the village of Vouv in Crete, there is an olive tree estimated to be between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. No one knows exactly how many centuries old it is, because carbon-14 has difficulty dating olive wood, and because written records mentioning specific trees do not exist from that far back. But the tree of Vouvs is enormous, twisted in ways that defy geometry, with a trunk that would require 5 adults to encircle with outstretched arms. And it produces olives every year, olives that are pressed to make oil. That oil is sold at extraordinary prices on international markets. There are buyers willing to pay substantial amounts for a bottle of oil produced by a tree that was possibly already growing. When Alexander the Great crossed the Mediterranean to conquer Persia, they are not paying for a superior product in purely chemical terms. They are paying for a connection to something modernity rarely offers. Continuity, an unbroken thread of time stretching from antiquity to a bottle they can hold in their hands today. Climate change is now the most serious threat facing the Mediterranean olive grove. The olive tree is adapted to dry, hot summers and cool winters, but without extreme frosts. What has been happening in the Mediterranean in recent decades is warming that exceeds the limits of that adaptation. Winters are increasingly warm, and the olive tree needs a period of winter cold for its flower buds to activate properly in spring. Without enough cold, olive trees produce fewer flowers and less fruit. At the same time, summers are increasingly hot and dry, subjecting the trees to water stress that reduces production, and in the most extreme cases, it kills specimens that have survived for centuries. Xylella fastidiosa, a bacterium that blocks the tree's conductive vessels and slowly dries it out, has devastated centuries-old olive groves in the Italian Salento, the heel region of the Italian boot, destroying millions of trees over the last 10 years. Scientists believe the bacterium spreads more rapidly under conditions of climate stress. The combination of global warming and emerging diseases is the greatest danger the Mediterranean olive grove has faced since the wars that destroyed Roman plantations in the 3rd century. There is a paradox at the heart of the history of olive oil that deserves to be named. The oil with the most health benefits, first pressed extra virgin from traditional varieties, is the hardest to produce, the most expensive, and the most counterfeited. Industrialized oil, refined, mixed, the one that fills most bottles sold in supermarkets worldwide at low prices, has few or none of the benefits that scientific research associates with quality extra virgin. Most consumers in the world consume olive oil, believing they are consuming the documented benefits of the Mediterranean diet, when in reality, they are consuming a product very different from the one consumed by the Cretans, whose cardiovascular health rates amazed Ansel Keys. In the 1950s, it is exactly the same deception that happened with sugar, with trans fats, with fruit juice presented as healthy. The food industry takes a food with real properties, processes it until those properties disappear or are drastically reduced, sells it with the name and image of the original food, and charges the price of the original. Bao 000. Years of history cannot be told without admitting that olive oil is probably the only product in human history that has been simultaneously food, medicina, fuel, cosmetic, currency, religious symbol, hygiene tool, building material, industrial lubricant, sports prize, and cause of war. There is no other. Wheat feeds, but does not illuminate. Gold has value, but does not nourish. Wine intoxicates, but does not heal wounds. Only olive oil has filled all those roles at the same time in civilizations separated by centuries and oceans, and it has done so without rushing, with the patient slowness of the tree that produces it, that tree that takes 40 years to reach its prime and can then keep producing for 3 millennia. The next time you open a bottle of oil, any bottle, look at the liquid before using it. If it is dark green or deep gold and has that slight cloudiness, indicating it hasn't been over-filtered, if it smells like something that reminds you of the countryside after rain or the bark of a tree, you might be holding something with a history longer and richer than anything you have ever touched in your whole life. That liquid came from a fruit that grew on a tree that probably already existed when your grandparents were born. It was pressed using methods that have not fundamentally changed in 500 years. And before reaching your hands, It passed through Neolithic Lebanon, Greek gymnasiums, Roman baths, Arab caliphates, medieval monasteries, Mediterranean trade routes, Andalusian mills, 19th century chemistry labs, and the steel containers of 21st century superports. Bar 000 years. And it is still here.